Hello there, everybody. Welcome to Psychedelics today. It's David here, and this is a wonderful conversation with Susan Beaulieu. And it's the fifth and final conversation we recorded at From Research to Reality in Toronto back in May. What a time that was. And when I had this chat with Susan, I actually did shed a couple of tears. I don't remember exactly what she was saying, but there was this emotion and feeling that kind of bubbled up inside of me, just realizing what she's doing in Minnesota, with her people of the Anishinaabe tribe in the Red Lake Nation, what this means historically. It's incredibly powerful. And she goes into some of the stories of her own life and her family, and she's a mum of 4, of how trauma, substance use affected her family and how it's affecting her tribe and her nation. And there's not much there to help. There's a huge need for healing. And they have some beautiful traditions, rites of passages, and customs that are kind of coming back, that are being reinvigorated. And there are questions there, and there's a dialogue happening that Susan's part of around, well, could psychedelics play a role here? Her nation don't have a history of plant medicines, but there's still some really valid conversations around, well, what would fit into our container, into our ancient traditions? There's the ketamine clinic model and the FDA MDMA model, and that will play a part for sure. And she's having those conversations. But there's also the traditional kind of sovereignty of the tribe and the traditions that they have, that kind of setting that's evolved over centuries. What could that look like as a healing container for the families, for the people that she's working with and providing support to in her community? So she talks about her experience going to Peru, supporting a family member there, and then to Costa Rica, and the trauma that she felt in her own body coming up that she didn't know was there, and remembering that, those parts of herself that were hidden away and the parts of her ancestors and that intergenerational trauma that is carried through her. And amazingly powerful hearing her speak about that. So she spoke about her body, particularly the Native American body, the female body, being a repository of knowledge, but also of trauma and the impact of racism and racialization in particular there. So I'll now read out the bio for Susan. She's an Anishinaabe citizen of the Red Lake Nation and has been working with Indigenous communities for the past 15 years in a variety of capacities, including project development, training, and facilitation. She previously served as the director of tribal projects at the Minnesota Communities Caring for Children, where she developed and implemented the tribal NEAR Sciences and Community Wisdom Project. Susan has worked the past 3 years for the University of Minnesota Extension as an Extension Educator, providing resources and support to tribal nations and communities around the state on topics including trauma and toxic stress, adverse childhood experiences, epigenetics and neuroscience, resilience and healing. She's pursuing her Ph.D. in social and administrative pharmacy at the University of Minnesota College of Pharmacy and received her master's in public policy from the University of Minnesota's Hubert H. Humphrey Institute. Susan was a 2016 Bush Leadership Fellow focused on learning about generating healing and well-being at the individual and collective levels. She's a mother of 4 and resides with her family in central Minnesota. Enjoy the episode, everybody. Horizons PBC, producer of the largest and longest running annual gathering of the psychedelic community in the world, is collaborating with the Sherry Eckert Foundation to host Horizons Northwest. This 5-day psychedelic learning event will take place at the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon, from September 13th through the 18th. For more information on the conference programs, speakers, and to register, please visit horizonspbc.com/Northwest and use the code Psychedelics Today -NW-17 to get 17% off. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Psychedelics Today podcast from Toronto, from Research to Reality Conference. And today, this is David Drapkin speaking with Susan Beaulieu. Wonderful to see you, Susan. Welcome.
Hi, David. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to be here. We've just chatted for half an hour before we press record. So I think this is going to be a wonderful chat. Tell me, first of all, how are you finding this conference? What's it like for you?
Yeah, it's been really great. People have been really supportive, interested to hear about like the work that we're doing in Minnesota with tribes and maybe how they might be able to help out. It's really heady. It's a good thing I get really excited about neuroscience and geek out on stuff like that too, but it's been pretty heady so far, but really interesting.
Have you seen any of the kind of poster presentations?
Unfortunately, I have not gotten to those yet.
That is heady. Yeah. So, lots of studies and, lots of neuroscience models and graphs. And statistics. But it's great how, thinking that we're connecting really amazing science with social policy and kind of, cultural, policy as well. It's amazing, the intersections that we're covering here.
Yeah.
And I know that's part of your work as well. I thought a great place to start would be, your position as a tribal community facilitator at the University of Minnesota Extension. Can you talk us through what that means and what you're doing in practice on the ground?
Yeah, sure. So I've been with Extension now for about 3.5 years. And when I first came in, I'd come into Extension from previous work I had done with tribes around understanding adverse childhood experiences, neuroscience, epigenetics, resilience, all of that. And so when I came into Extension, they had a grant through SAMHSA to work on the opioid issue in our tribal communities. And I said, I'm fine with that, but I recognize that substance use issues are very much connected to unresolved trauma. So if I'm not able to talk about and work with our communities on that, I don't want to be part of this work. And they were like, yes, absolutely. We need to understand this. And so I've been doing lots and lots of trainings, presentations, things like that, but also running and facilitating mind body medicine groups, specifically with people who are either in treatment or in outpatient treatment settings in our tribal communities. And then also I build a lot of those practices into the presentations I do, because I really feel like, there's something about learning something in the head, which is great. I've spent most of my life, being up here in my head. That's what we learn in school, that's what's important, what you know in your head. But what I've come to understand is when you have a more embodied experience of something, that learning goes so much deeper and it sticks with you. And so I try to build in mind body practices to help people feel what it feels like to reconnect with their body. Feel what it feels like to reconnect with their emotions, with their spirit, to understand and pay attention to the thoughts that are playing in their mind, right? So trying to give people experiential with that. So, so that's pretty much most of the work that I do with Extension right now.
Wonderful. And to continue from that, in your body, Susan, when you're educating people in your community and talking about these subjects, what do you feel in your body? What does it do for you in your own body?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think early on when I started this work, I was very early on in my healing journey. And so it was actually pretty exhausting. When you're talking about trauma all the time and you're talking about ACEs and you have a lot of your own stuff that you carry around that, it triggers and activates that in a way that can be really depleting. And so being 6 or 8 years past that now, what I find is when I do these trainings, when I facilitate these groups, it's actually really energizing because I'm able to share a lot more about my own story and what's been helpful, and being able to, what I love too is when you're sharing information with them, or we do a practice and then they share how it is resonating with them, new connections that they're making. That's energizing too, right? So it's it reminds me that our healing is very much interconnected. And so as one person is getting an insight or either into their body or their thoughts or their emotions or whatever it is, that energy permeates the space. And, it's been hard with COVID the last couple years because most of our work has been online. But even with that, I can still feel and sense that happening. And it actually is really energizing.
Yeah. So even though it's online, not in person, you can feel other people as well.
Absolutely.
getting invigorated by this.
Yeah.
And what are some of the exercises you're doing? Because it sounds almost like it's kind of guided meditations, perhaps. How are you structuring it?
Yeah, so some of it, a lot, not all, but a lot of the practices. So I was trained in the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, Dr. James Gordon. And so one of the foundational practices for that is soft belly breathing, which is just deep diaphragmatic breathing. Mm-hmm. And so just reminding people that often when we're in that fight or flight survival mode, we're breathing short and shallow in our chest. And so inviting them to bring that breath down into the diaphragm, then people are able to experience what happens when that vagal nerve is activated, sending the message to the brain like, oh, I'm safe. And their body begins, like I've had people say, I didn't know my body could get that relaxed. Because they've been in that hypervigilant state so long with the muscles tense. And then when they do a simple soft belly breathing practice for 2 or 3 minutes, they feel just this tension releasing from their body. And so that's again why I feel that connecting I talk about the science behind it. I talk about some of those pieces, but then giving that experience of it, people remember that. And then the other thing is I feel like for me on this healing journey, it's one thing, if you're talking about something, but part of the integration is the practice. You're using these practices on a regular basis to help you navigate our lives, because difficult things happen. Even if trauma isn't currently happening to somebody, stress is still happening. And so that like being in tune and in touch with your body and noticing like, when is my breathing short and shallow? When are my hands cold and clammy? When do I feel my gut sort of reeling? All of these messages that our body is giving us, that we're in that fight or flight response, that when we're in it all the time, we don't tend to notice it. That's just what's normal and natural. And so the more I try to help people understand like what's happening in the body. And when you notice that's the key, is the noticing, right? So mindfulness practices, I teach a lot of those too. As soon as you notice it, oh, maybe I need to do some soft belly breathing. And then they know they have that practice in their toolbox because we've not only talked about it, but they've also practiced it.
Wonderful. It's amazing, isn't it, to think that we can live in a state of trauma and of being traumatized and tense, and that seems normal. We can just get used to that and hold it all in, particularly in the belly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's one of the pieces too that, and I don't know if I've shared this piece with you, but I talked about this yesterday on the panel, is like, when I think about how science is done and Western science and on all of that, there's this recognition that we have a mind, that we have a body. We might talk a little bit about emotions. We won't talk about spirit at all. But as Indigenous people, we really believe that we are first and foremost spiritual beings in physical bodies, having human thoughts and having human emotions, right? And so like so much of this work is about reconnecting those parts of our being. And that when we are out of balance or out of alignment with any of those pieces, it throws everything out of balance and alignment. So these practices are ways to be able to tune back into those 4 parts of who we are, to balance and align them and to integrate. And so that like remembering of, what's going on in the body, what's coming up with emotions, what thought, and recognizing how they all influence one another, that my thoughts impact my emotions, and my thoughts and emotions then have a physiological response, and a physiological response might activate a thought or an emotion, right? It is all interconnected. And so the more that we understand this, and especially in our Indigenous communities, helping people remember that, I think that's a really important piece of this healing journey, because otherwise we're just we're treating symptoms. And my own experience has really led me to understand that it is the integration of all of those parts and the connecting on a regular daily basis with those 4 parts of who we are.
I want to get personal in just a moment. Before we do, I feel like it's good to take a step back and understand who you're working with. And you said the word remembering, what you do a lot with the community. So what community are you working with? You can describe the kind of people that you're doing these kind of events and experiences and sessions with.
Yeah. So I live in Minnesota. I'm a citizen of the Red Lake Nation. And there are 11 tribal communities or reservations, sovereign nations in Minnesota. Through my work with Extension, I primarily have worked with 2 and there are 7 Anishinaabe tribes and there are 4 Dakota tribes or communities in Minnesota. So primarily with Extension, we've been working with Anishinaabe communities, 2 in particular, and also a lot of my work specific to mind-body medicine, as I think I had mentioned, is connected to people who are in treatment, either in a treatment facility or in outpatient treatment settings. So.
Got it. And you yourself are Anishinaabe?
Yes.
And of the Red Lake Nation?
Yeah.
Where is that exactly?
So if you look at a map of Minnesota, if you look in northern Minnesota, you'll see two big lakes that are connected, Upper and Lower Red Lake. So the Red Lake Nation is around Upper and Lower Red Lake. And at one point early on in the treaties, like the Red Lake Reservation was pretty much all of that northern part of Minnesota, the northwest angle, and actually into North Dakota. I won't get into all of the stuff around land loss and whatever. But so the reservation is significantly smaller now than it initially was, but it's still pretty large. And it's actually one of two tribal nations in the country that did not agree to the Dawes Act, which basically allotted land, divided up the land and gave so many acres to each Indigenous male adult, and then sold the rest off to white people. So in Red Lake, all of the land is still held in trust in common. None of the land was allotted out. And like I said, I believe we're one of just two reservations that across the country that were able to avoid the Allotment Act.
And how does that manifest now in the modern day, being set different to the other nations' experiences?
Yes. So it really does have big implications. Some of them have to do with in the Red Lake Nation, county and state jurisdiction doesn't hold any water at all in Red Lake. Pretty much it's the Red Lake. And then if there's any sort of like a federal crime or something like that, then the feds will come in. But otherwise, everything that happens in Red Lake is run by the Red Lake Nation.
So there's no greater sovereignty there.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah.
And going back to your personal story that you said at the beginning before we press record, and you also just mentioned the word remembering, like remembering. Mm-hmm. And you're saying, personally, you went through your own journey of realizing there was some trauma there, perhaps, that wasn't obvious. And a lot of the people that you're working with in your community have that same experience. There's you've talked about that being really in a parallel process, but further ahead, perhaps, than the collective experiences of your nation. So talking about your personal experience, if you want to start from the beginning, it's normally a good place to start.
Yeah.
Would that be all right? Just to tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So it was probably about 9 years ago that my husband was in treatment for opioid addiction. And at some point in that, he had heard about ayahuasca. But then we ended up separating, and we were separated for about 7-8 months. But he still wanted to go down to Ecuador to do plant medicine to see if that could help. And I thought, I'll go down and I'll support him. I mean, we have 2 children. I love him. I'm trying to be supportive. I'm like, okay, I'll go down. I'll do this with you. And it was clear very early on in the first ceremony that I sat in that I had a boatload of my own work to do. And like you said, things that, and this is what I've come to understand is just because we don't have an awareness that something is impacting us does not mean that things are not impacting us. There's so much that's happening at the energetic and subconscious levels that impact our thoughts, that impact how we show up in this world. And so it just became really clear that I had a lot of work to do. And it was in the second ceremony that during a really deep purge, as the purge was coming up, it was like, this is your mom's stuff you've been carrying. This is your dad's. This is your grandma's. And at this point, I knew a little bit about epigenetics, and it just became really clear to me that both epigenetically and intergenerationally through patterns and habits and things like that, this energy had gotten passed on to me. And it was an opportunity in the medicine to help clear some of that. And just a lot of really deep healing and insights that happened that I continued to integrate for a while afterwards. And I had mentioned to you, sort of funny, when we came back and my parents had been watching our 2 kids when we were gone. And actually, 3, I have a daughter from a previous relationship, and then my husband and I have now 3 kids together, but we had 2 together at the time. And so I was talking to my mom and dad about it, and my mom looked at me and she's like, you're going to be back. And I was like, oh no, I'm good. Cause it's a really intense process and experience. I was like, yeah, no, that's a once in a lifetime thing. I'm good to go. And then it was about 9 months later, I started feeling the call again. And so then at that time, it was about almost a year after we had been to Ecuador, we ended up going down to Costa Rica and sat with the medicine, ayahuasca, a few more sessions, and PT344 actually had some really profound healing and insights. And what the medicine really did was open me up to all of this stuff that was happening at these levels that I didn't even realize were a thing. Like I said, energetically. And it's interesting because as an Indigenous woman, we hear things like, we're all connected, we're all related. We're spirits in a physical body, having thoughts, having emotions. But when you're in the medicine and you feel it, you have this full-bodied experience of it. It's a totally different thing. And so suddenly these things that I had been taught became real. They came alive in me. And that really set me on a path to try to, even like in our communities, we say these things, but what we say and what we do don't always align. And what I understood was that misalignment has to do with unresolved trauma. And so I really believe that the more that we can heal this unresolved trauma that we carry individually and collectively in our Indigenous communities, the more access we will have to this Indigenous wisdom that also is within us. When we think about epigenetics, it's not just the trauma that gets passed on. Epigenetics is about survival. So it's also the resilience and the knowledge of our ancestors that gets passed on. And so how do we, as Indigenous people, really tap into that again? And I think the more that we're able to heal, the more we're going to be able to tap into that.
Thank you. There's so much to go here, different directions. And as infinite beings, I wish we could kind of go in all directions all at once. It's really key what you're saying, that we're combining those parts of us that we've forgotten. And that includes the body and the emotions and the spirit, not just our head. And it's one thing to think about these things, but to feel them. And it's so hard to feel, who am I? Where am I? What do I need to do? And it's even harder then to try and teach someone how to do that or express it, explain it. And that's the beauty of medicines, plant medicines and psychedelics, is that they give that person their own unique opportunity to go into that place. Just sticking with you for a bit more, Susan, in your experiences, first when your husband got called to Peru, then the second time when you got called to Costa Rica, and experiences since then, how do you feel like your own initiation into psychedelics has maybe colored or influenced and evolved your life calling and your sense of self and purpose?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. And I don't have a time machine, so I can't go back in time. And if I hadn't done plant medicines, where would my life be now? But when I think about the pivotal point in which my life changed, it was through plant medicines. Like, so many things have opened up for me since then. One of the things shortly after I came back from my first plant medicine experience in Ecuador, I was a bush fellow at the time. And so bush fellowships are something that people in sort of the area I live in, there's a big foundation called the Bush Foundation. And I had received a fellowship to be able to focus on healing. And I wanted to look at healing at the individual, family, and collective levels. And so I really was able to use my fellowship and the learning that I had gotten down in Ecuador and then the follow-up in Costa Rica to really follow those threads and learn within myself those pieces around individual healing, family, collective, and then being able to bring what I was learning. One of the ways that our communities learn best is through story. That's how teachings and traditions have been passed on for thousands and thousands of years, is not in written documents, but in stories and in language. And so being able to share personal stories about our own healing and in the work that I do right now, and we talked a little bit about this before we started recording, but there is still very much a stigma around psychedelics and in our Indigenous communities because substances have been used as a way to cope with this unresolved trauma that we carry individually and collectively. There's this taboo against drugs or using substances. And so I don't talk a lot yet in our communities about my experience with psychedelics for healing, but I know that they have catalyzed my healing in a way that, like I said, I can't go back and see where I would be now, but I can tell you without everything in my being says, I know I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. Mm-hmm. There have been so many doors that have opened, connections that have been made, insights that I've had so I'll just give you a simple example. shortly after I went through the first ceremony, I was doing some work in White Earth, and it was over the summer. So I had one of my daughters with, and she was probably like 7 or 8 at the time, loved playing with Legos. So I was like, well, Sophia, pack up some stuff and you can come with me. So she went with me. And on the way back home, she's like in the backseat of the car, trying to build a house out of Legos on her lap with nothing. So like it's falling apart. She's getting super frustrated, right? And I knew a little bit about mind body practice stuff. So I'm like, Sophia, let's take some deep breaths. And she's back there going, and I'm like, and I can feel, like I literally can feel the energy just getting more and more intense. And what I noticed is like the intensity in me was so overwhelming that in that moment, I had 2 options. I could start screaming and tell her to knock it off, which is what I was, what I learned as a kid, or I could just check out. I could dissociate, because that was my primary coping mechanism for most of my life. And so in that moment, I chose what I thought was the lesser of 2 evils. And I still to some degree think it is. And I decided to just check out. But I was very aware in that moment. And I really feel like the medicine continues to work on us in ways that we don't understand long after we've drank the medicine. I was very aware that in that moment, the message I was sending her is, your emotions are too big for me. I can't handle it. If you want to stay in connection with me, you need to shut that down. Even though I hadn't said anything to her. And I was so aware in that moment of how I was passing on some of those same messages to shut down, to not be connected to your emotions, to disconnect from your body, because we feel emotions in our body. So if our emotions are big and intense and we're not allowed to feel and we don't have a safe place to move through that, it ends up, we feel it in the body. And if we, because it's overwhelming, we have to check out then, right? So like I was aware that that's what I'm passing on to her. And so that became a moment where I realized I have to learn to sit with my own big emotions if I want to be able to sit with my children when they're having big emotions. And so that learning and insight and the work that I've been able to do around that has been so incredibly helpful as I facilitate mind body groups and difficult things come up for people, or I'm doing a training or presentation and something difficult comes up for someone. Instead of me being triggered and activated by it, I can sit with it. I can be with it, right? A lot of times people talk about like this holding space. And really when I think about holding space, it's about somebody not being reactive to whatever's coming up in us is not activating something in them that's shutting them down or making them hypervigilant, but instead that person is able to be with us and allow that emotion to just be there, to feel it, to experience it in a safe way that allows it to move. Energy, emotions are energy. Everything is energy, but including emotions. And so if we don't have the opportunity to feel them, that's when they end up getting stuck in the body. They end up getting stuck in like ruminating thoughts and, stuck cycles of emotion, like depression and things like that. So I feel like I'm rambling now, but I'm sorry, David, I don't remember your question.
Let's keep rambling. So you're basically talking about intergenerational trauma here, but on the individual personal level. Right. And we'll talk more about the community level and on the level of the nation that you're part of and working with. But personally, as a mum, to be in that situation with your daughter in the car and your own trauma is being triggered, as you are seeing the trauma within your daughter and you've got that awareness, how do I react to this? So there's that sense of choice. That's part one. There's also another part that you're talking about, which is, you haven't used these words. I'd love to know what words resonate with you. The next part is kind of love, forgiveness, compassion. Are there words in particular that have stood out for you around how you work on your own level around that response to your own trauma and the intergenerational trauma, and how also the words that you use when you're kind of educating others about that? Yeah,
I the words that you use, love and compassion definitely resonate with me. One of the things that I've come to understand about trauma and the trauma response is that there's a wisdom in it. That when all of the ways that we respond physically, biologically, mentally, emotionally, even spiritually to trauma helps us to be able to survive. and things become trauma, not necessarily because of the event themselves, but it's more about like what is happening within us. Do we have the internal tools to deal with it? Do we have the external supports to help us deal with it? So it's not always just, and this is, I think, something that's frustrating too within this larger field, is so much of it falls on the individual, but we are interconnected. And right now, as we sit here, our energies are impacting one another, right? And so if we don't have the tools ourselves, which you think about kids, they come into this world, they don't have the ability to regulate themselves. They rely on co-regulation from adults. And so if the adults don't have the ability to regulate, then the child doesn't learn how to regulate. And so when I think about like the generations, my parents, they didn't know how to regulate. They didn't know how to be with their emotions, so they couldn't help us be with ours. Their parents didn't have the ability because of the traumas that they, right? So you talk about that intergenerational piece, so that inability to sit with and be with difficult emotions. When you're in that like constant state of trauma and you don't have the individual or collective resources to help you navigate it, shutting your emotions down helps. That's a helpful survival tool. The problem is when those situations, like you're no longer in these like extreme trauma situations. I'm not, at that time when that happened with my daughter, I was in my mid 30s. I was no longer that 2, 4, 6, 12, whatever year old girl, but I was activated as if I was. So that's the problem, is like when those triggers, they throw us back into the past. We don't even realize that, but suddenly we're responding from these places of like all of that unresolved stuff within us. And so we have to either shut it down by dissociating, or we just become really overwhelmed.
And on a collective level as well, Susan, it's impossible to express or calculate how much trauma Native Americans have been through intergenerationally.
Yeah.
And for communities that have been through trauma on many, many levels, we inherit that. So it's almost like it's not the contemporary generation have the least. In a sense, we have the most, because we have our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents within us now. And that's why we're giving it to our kids. So do you have a sense, what kinds of traumas are we actually literally talking about in your nation, in your people, that people are sharing that they have in common?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. David and I talk about this a lot in our tribal communities, is trying to help people understand that what we're dealing with is compounded trauma through generations. Like you're saying, it wasn't just my own experiences growing up, which were enough. They were enough to cause, a lot of the sort of responses that I had around depression and anxiety as from the ages of 11 to 18 or whatever. But then you add on the intergenerational piece and how. So I'll give you an example. So one of the things, there's been so many traumas to Indigenous communities. And one of the things that I, in the work that I do, and my colleague Brianna Matrias, we talk a lot about the impact of boarding schools in our communities. And when we think about traditionally Indigenous communities, a lot of Indigenous societies, communities were set up where like even the term we used for our children was like sacred being. Like or sacred bundle, like we recognize them as the spirit beings that they were, as the gift that they were. They really were the heart of our communities. Everything revolved around our kids. And it wasn't just a nuclear family. Like aunts and uncles in a lot of our tribal communities were called mom and dad. Cousins were siblings. There were extended family networks that supported each and every child in the community. So when you have a system that's set up in that way, where children are supported on every single level, they're watched to see what gifts they bring. Those gifts are nurtured so that they can bring those to the community, right? And then when the boarding schools happened, and they happened because the federal government hadn't been successful at assimilating Indigenous people. And I also talk about this a lot in the work that I do, is like literally what you have in the Americas when contact happened was this collision of two very different paradigms of how the world works. One is very materialistic, very reductionist, very hierarchical.
An individual.
Yeah. You have, white, wealthy, landowning men at the top, and then all the way down to like, the ants and the soil and, all of those things. So there's just I think of it, actually, there was an Indigenous woman who does work on ecology and stuff like that. And she talked about like, so that's like the pyramid, right? That's sort of like that paradigm of like that hierarchical top bottom. And in Indigenous communities, it was a circle where everything and everyone was within that circle. And there was no center of the circle. We're all connected. We all impact one another. And so it's non-hierarchical. It's about relationships and interconnections and respect and reciprocity. You don't take more than what you need. You only you realize that even if you're taking a medicine from the earth, you give something in return. So as Anishinaabe people, we would say a prayer. We would tell that plant like why we needed to pick it, what we were going to use it for. We would put our sema or our tobacco down as an offering, and then we would take that plant. It was the same thing with if you were going to go out fishing or hunting or anything else. There was this respect for the fact that you will be taking the life of a sentient being, right? So there was really this understanding of the interconnection of everything. So you have this collision of these two paradigms, and you can't make money if you're living from the paradigm, right? Like the way everything was set up over in Europe, and, money and wealth and power. And it was just such a different paradigm than what existed here for Indigenous peoples. And so because as Indigenous peoples, we had not just our human relatives, but we had plant and animal relatives. We had deep relationships with the beings that were around us. It was like, well, you can't own land, and you can't just, till up, all of the grass in the prairies, and you can't just cut down all the trees in the forest, but that's what was happening. And so because of that, it was like Indigenous people, like we were like, no. And so they were all, we were fighting against forced assimilation. And that's why you had lots of war and things like that. And so then when the federal government realized like, okay, they're not going to be able to assimilate the adults, that's when they took the children. And we know now with the science too, that children, in the early years of life, there's so much more, their brains are so much more malleable, they're impacted a lot more. And so they took the children, and some children as young as 3 years old. Some children would be in a boarding school for a couple years. Some would be in a boarding school for 12, 15 years. Some never were able to go back home. And in the boarding schools, you had just, I do lots of training on ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Like just about every ACE there is, Indigenous children experienced it in the boarding schools: physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, emotional neglect, spiritual neglect and abuse. I mean, told that our ways were wrong, we're evil, we're bad. The point, the first boarding school that was opened by Richard Pratt was kill the Indian, save the man. So like kill everything there was about our culture, but keep the person alive, right? And so when all of those traumas are happening to young people, generation after generation, because there's multiple generations in the boarding schools, how do you deal with all of that trauma? And so what people did is they had to shut down emotionally. So when you shut down emotionally and then you have kids of your own, how can you be there emotionally for them? You can't. And so that's just one example of like when I told my story about not being able to emotionally be present with my daughter, that stems from generations ago of boarding school and unresolved trauma. And the other thing that I'll say quickly is, so in our Indigenous communities, at the individual, at the family, and at the collective levels, we had processes, protocols, ceremonies, daily, weekly, all of these different ways to help support all the parts of who we are: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And so many of those were intentionally dismantled or attacked through colonization and assimilation. And so we had all of these processes and protocols to help at all of those different levels. And it's one thing if a trauma befalls a family within a community that has all of those supports, because the rest of the community is able to come around and help support that family or individual. But when the attack is happening across the entire community and those practices are made illegal and the children are taken, who holds the space? And so I feel like that's part of what we're also trying to work through in our communities, is that there have been some people and some pockets in our community that have been able to retain that traditional Indigenous wisdom and knowledge and practices. Some of those things had to go underground, but there's a whole bunch of our people in our communities that no longer have access to that. They didn't grow up with those traditions, because of things like boarding schools. And because up until 1978, it was illegal to practice our spiritual ways in Minnesota, or not Minnesota, across the United States as Indigenous people. And people a lot of times say like, oh, historical trauma, like that was, I used to literally hear people say, that was a long time ago. How come y'all don't get over it, right? And the reality is that I was born in 79. So it was just 1 year before I was born that it became legal for my family to even sit in the sweat lodge again. So it's some of that too, is like our people are, we're trying to reconnect to and remember. I talked about that too. Like it's remembering at all of these levels, the individual level, but also this community and collective level, bringing these practices back and remembering, why did we do them? What parts of ourselves were those supporting? And then also remembering the interconnection of the healing of all of us, that when one of us is healing, I know even in my own journey, I have seen how the work that I've done has been able to ripple out into how I show up as a mom, or how I show up as a partner, or how I show up as a sister or a daughter or a friend or a colleague or a person facilitating a mind-body medicine group, right? And so that then ripples out. And then I've seen like my sister and how the changes that she's made now are impacting how she shows up for her kids, right? And so it just becomes this beautiful, just outflowing of healing energy that can happen. And bringing these practices and remembering these things, bringing them back in, is such a critical piece of this journey.
Beautiful. Thank you. And the remembering is of your culture that was banned. And, I love the idea of this circle.
Yeah.
Being this self-sufficient, content, like, this is our circle. And that makes it very hard for a federal government to control you.
Yeah.
To be able to say this is allowed, this isn't allowed. But if there's a pyramid and someone's on top of that pyramid and it's not you, then you can be controlled. And on the subject of sovereignty and medicine work and reclaiming your culture, your traditions, your rites of passage, what's happening at the moment in your nation and with your people around the reclaiming of your heritage, but also, in a sense, the owning of your trauma? And how might plant medicines and non-ordinary states of consciousness help, in particular, with some of that trauma healing?
Yeah. So there is a lot of resurgence of different parts of culture throughout our communities. So, more ceremonies that are happening, more reconnecting back, getting outdoors, reconnecting with nature. And it's happening in pockets. One of the things that there's a couple different things that we've seen though. One of the things that we've seen, and it makes sense given the attack on our culture. Sometimes in our communities, there are folks that we call like culture police. So those people who like know how culture is supposed to be done. And if you don't do it right, then, you're shamed and you're put in your place and da-da-da-da-da. And what I know and have experienced is that healing and learning doesn't happen when shaming happens. It doesn't happen when the ways and sometimes in which people are trying to, it's this hard thing because culture, there was this attempt to completely dismantle it. There's this like clinging to what we, the parts of our culture that still remain to try to like maintain them in some way. So I totally get and understand that. And yet that some of the best Indigenous teachers that I've had have been patient, are very like, when you don't get it right, they lovingly explain to you why we do what we do and how we do it. And they understand the importance of like the energy that we're putting into something. There was an elder one time we were doing some work with around Native youth stuff. And, I think this happens in life all the time. We like the things we tend to do, we tend to not give much thought to. We just sort of go through the process of it, getting dressed in the morning, brushing our teeth, eating our food, all those things, right? And
sometimes all at the same time as well.
Right.
In a busy morning. Carry on, sorry.
Right. Yeah. And so one of the practices that we often do in our communities before we have an important meeting is we smudge. We use sage and maybe sweetgrass or cedar or something like that to just, clear ourselves energetically, clear the space, clear our minds, our hearts so that we can can have a good conversation, and so that it can be done in a good way. We're really, setting the space, creating the container for good work to happen. And so as the smudge bowl is going around, people are just sort of quick smudging off and whatever. And this elder said, he didn't say like, don't do it that way. He said, as the smudge bowl is going around, like really pay attention and notice like, why, what are you smudging and why? What are we doing as we're clearing? So he just invited us to be really present and intentional with what we were doing. And so as that really has always stuck with me. And part of it is because to me, culture isn't just the activities you do, but it's how you do the activities that you do. As I think about Anishinaabe people, there are 7 values, 7 primary values that are supposed to drive everything that we do, including love, humility, respect, things like that. And so when you think about if somebody attends a ceremony, like a woman, and she's not wearing a skirt, but she's supposed to be wearing a skirt, and somebody shames them, they might be going to a Ojibwe ceremony, but is it done in an Anishinaabe Ojibwe way? If it's not done in the values of love and respect and generosity, does the activity itself make it cultural? And I would argue that it doesn't. That actually what makes something Anishinaabe is it done in those 7 values, those grandfather teachings that we were given. And so I think part of what, as Indigenous people, we have to sit with is teasing apart like what is actually culture and what is part of the trauma that has become part of how we do things, teasing that apart and really reconnecting back into the values, which then I believe when we move from that place of those values, then everything that we do literally can be healing. Like everything our ancestors did was done in those values, and that's what made it sacred.
This is beautiful because I connect with what you're saying around rules and traditions being there to keep us alive. As a Jewish man and thousands of years being refugees and kicked around, our traditions maintained a culture and identity, and at the same time, they, particularly nowadays, the last 100 years or so, they've also turned a lot of people off. Like, what? I want to go and watch football or watch TV, go to the pub and eat this and drink that. Why can't I do that because of my religion? So there is that tension there about the generations of ancestors not wanting our traditions to die. These rules will keep our tradition and our people alive and safe. And there's that conflict between safety, survival, and rules and rigidity.
Yeah.
So I wonder what kind of renaissance perhaps we could be, on the precipice of. And I'm not a big fan of the word, psychedelic renaissance. But what I'm hearing you saying is that your people are slowly kind of remembering, rethinking, recreating what it means to be Anishinaabe. And as a woman, particularly in this space, and as a teacher in your community. So psychedelics, you're not saying go out to do ayahuasca, everybody. There's many, first come into your body, breathe. And there's also, the rich cultural traditions and history to know about. But let's try and build that circle up again.
Yeah.
And what else can come into that circle? But particularly just maybe to think about psychedelics and your experiences, sounded incredibly powerful. You've spoken about ACEs and intergenerational trauma in your community. And you, I think, touched on substance use being rife as well in your community. And we're here at this conference with scientists talking about their papers of psychedelics for substance use disorders. So maybe just for now, what are your thoughts about how this could move forward potentially?
Yeah. So, exactly. Like so many of the, the researchers that we've been hearing from over the last couple of days have talked about psychedelics for substance use issues, for mental health issues, for, even things, and this is, I'll try not to go off on a tangent on this either, but even thinking about things like neurogenesis. And as I think about our communities and potentially psychedelics opening up windows of plasticity that maybe haven't been available to us, when you think about something like language is so much easier to learn in the first 5 years than afterwards. You can still learn a second language after. It's just significantly harder. The brain isn't primed. It's primed for it in 0 to 5. And so one of the things that was one of the things that is hard for, how do I say this? Because it's not been taken, it's not been lost, but our Indigenous languages There's not a lot of people that are fluent speakers anymore. And language shapes our reality. And so for just give you a quick example, in Anishinaabe language, like there are like thousands of verbs because it's a language that is in action, it's emotion, it's about relationship, right? So my dad's dad, he was fluent in Ojibwe, French, and English, and he could say blueberry pie, which if you wrote it on a board, it'd be like 2 sentences long because literally it's explaining what is blueberry pie? How do you make blueberry pie? So it's a descriptive language. So it tells us about our relationship to things. So language is really important. And when we think about the ceremonies we do, language is an important component of that to be able to understand, because there are words in Ojibwe Moen that we don't have in English. So they're not translatable. You can't just use English in an Ojibwe ceremony because you can't convey everything that needs to be conveyed. So language is really important. So thinking about things even like psychedelics for being able to help with language reacquisition in our tribal communities. There are some tribal communities where they're down to 4 or 5 fluent speakers and they're in their 70s and 80s. What happens if they pass, right? So there's this sort of scramble for Indigenous people to try and capture our languages so that they don't get lost, so they aren't forgotten, because that's happening around the world, right? Around languages. But going back to thinking about things like substance use issues, severe mental health issues, we have some of the worst crises, especially when it comes to our kids with suicide attempts, suicidality. And so thinking about psychedelics to be able to help with some of those really, what would be the word? Just, this isn't the word I want to use, but just crisis situations. I mean, some of the experiences I've had with psychedelics have been helpful just in like personal growth and development. But when you think about some of you can't even get to that until you resolve some of the stuff that's driving substance use issues or your severe mental health challenges or the reason why you no longer want to be alive, right? And so I feel like psychedelics, one of the things that I know and have experienced is that there are things that happen individually and intergenerationally that we just cannot touch with therapy. We cannot address through sitting down and talk therapy or something like that. And so psychedelics help to open, and it's been interesting. They've been talking a lot about how it opens up the brain and there's more connectivity and it's more plasticity and all of those pieces. But I also wonder, because I also know that Western science is very much confined by how far along is the technology. I'm really interested in how do these medicines impact us energetically as well? Like, what is it activating within the body? What is it activating within the heart and the spirit that is allowing all of these things to come up? I guarantee you it's not just things that's happening in the brain, but we don't have the technology yet to be able to measure these other things. So, I feel like psychedelics can really be a catalyst to help us address some of these issues that are consuming so much time and energy and resources. It's literally like putting out fire after fire, and people are in this crisis mode constantly. I feel like psychedelics can help at least, and again, I recognize that they're not for everyone. We've talked before this conference, everyone recognizes the importance of preparation ahead of time, proper set and setting, good integration afterwards. All of those are critical pieces to use. I would never recommend somebody just go do psychedelics if they've never done it before, if they, that all of those pieces are important for the learning and the healing to happen and to stick, to not just be an experience that you had, but something that you integrate into your life in a way that it changes how you show up in the world, how you understand yourself, how you understand your place in your world, in your family, in your community. And so I feel like there's a lot of those pieces that psychedelics could help our Indigenous communities heal and reconnect those parts of ourselves to be. And I really believe a lot of the struggles that we have with addiction, mental health issues, suicides with our young people that we're experiencing, a lot of that is going to fall away naturally as the healing happens.
Thank you. And listening to you speaking, some of the members of your community might do well going to, say, a ketamine clinic like Field Trip or, Numinous, something like that, but they might not. Then what's an alternative? So say someone's listening to you talking now and they're like, well, I need this. I'm open to this. I'd like to try it. Susan, what can I do? Like, how do I get this? I'm ready to go for it. What can they do in your nation? What's legal? What options are there at the moment?
So in Minnesota right now, in our tribal nations, there are not options. And that's something that myself and my colleague, Brianna Matrias, we're trying to figure out, like, how do we, with the support of tribal communities, how do we create pathways and avenues beyond what's being explored in the Western medical model of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, right? So what are some other models that might resonate better with our communities? I mean, one of the things that we've talked about is like this interconnection and relationship is so important to our Indigenous worldview and perspective. And so the thought of of having opportunities for groups to go through, or a family to go through a process with psychedelics, with preparation, ceremony, and integration afterwards. And then also, thinking about, and this is just my own side, but again, that piece around, and I don't see the field doing it yet, but capturing those ripple out effects of that, yes, psychedelics can help heal at the individual level, but it's also healing at these other levels. And how do we sort of capture that as well? But yeah, I mean, We've been having conversations with Dr. Joe Tafur. I know that he has the Reciprocity Project with ketamine that he's trying to, get started and be able to bring Indigenous people in to, experience sessions with ketamine and healing with that. Because right now that's sort of the only legal option here in the States. Yeah, I know he's brought groups down to Peru. Some other folks have, gone to South America. Sometimes we, like some of the things that I've connected to have been here in the States, but they've not been legal. So there's a risk with that. And so I would not recommend that somebody do something that's outside of the legal realms unless they're willing to sort of, bear the consequences of that. And so right now it's really limited. It's like you go to Mexico or to Central or South America, or you might be able to connect to ketamine. Good luck, So we're really trying to figure out how do we bring more opportunities to be able to work with these medicines, whether it be, plants or whether it be, even synthetics, things like ketamine or MDMA or something like that. And I'm also really intrigued with the MDMA. I've not ever sat with that medicine before, but it's part of what intrigues me about it is that a lot of times when people do have a lot of stress and trauma, unresolved stress and trauma, if that starts to come up, the amygdala is going to be firing like crazy. And I have been with people in ceremony before who have a really strong response, don't have the tools to be able to regulate and just fight with the medicine the whole time. And so I'm really curious with MDMA and people like Indigenous people who've experienced a ton of trauma, a medicine that helps to quiet the amygdala, to allow us to see and to work through whatever is coming up for us without that amygdala just going nuts. I'm really curious. And I think that could be potentially a medicine that's a little bit easier to sort of come in initially to help with some of the, when we talk about things like substance use or, yeah.
So it sounds like you're really open to talking to people to make anything happen in a legal framework, rather than having to send people to Peru, Costa Rica, because that's the only place it's available. Right.
And that's not sustainable. Like we would never, like there's not enough money in the world to send all of the Indigenous people in North America down to South America plus the integration, there's just not. So we really have to think about like, how do we make these medicines, these opportunities for healing legal and in our communities, and that's another piece of it is like having done ceremonies and then come back. And then it's like 6 years ago, like, where do you go for supports? Now there's more of that. But as I think about this work rolling out within our Indigenous communities, we need to really be thinking about that up front. Like how do we make sure that we connect people to some of our own ceremonies, to some of our own things that are happening in our communities to help with that integration process, whether it's sweats, whether it's midday, whether it's, sitting with an elder, like whatever that might be, but like really thinking through those pieces because the supports and the integration on the backside is, I think, just as essential as when you're sitting with the medicine.
Yeah. And you have all of the technology that you need.
Exactly.
Cultural technology, social technology. What molecule are you going to use? It's just a bloody molecule.
Yeah.
And I know there are some kind of Native American churches that have particular plants, peyote, for example, that they have used for, a long time. But I think what we're saying in your nation, that's not the case with a particular plant. And so there's that, in a sense, pragmatism around well, look, we have acute need here
Yeah.
with trauma, with suicidality, with substance use. And the colonial system that is responsible for that is still responsible for preventing you from accessing treatment in a way that is culturally appropriate for your nation. You've got the technology culturally, you've got the circles, you've got the stories, you've got the elders, you've got the language, you've got smudge, you've got sweat lodge, you've got the circle. But there's still the force of colonialization that doesn't allow you to hold space in ways that could truly be what you need locally without having to fly around the world to do it.
Right.
You can't take a whole community or village to Peru.
Yeah, absolutely. And I that made me think, as you were talking about that, like, I don't think I actually did get into the piece around tribal sovereignty when you had asked the question earlier. So I appreciate you bringing that piece back up, because I feel like that when we talk about the potential to bring psychedelics into Indigenous communities in the United States, I really feel like that doorway or that pathway of using tribal sovereignty, that as sovereign nations, we should have the ability to choose how we heal, when we heal, all of those pieces, and that should not be determined by anybody outside of our community, especially the governments that inflicted the harm in the first place. That really should be up to our communities to decide when 100%. And how and all of that. And resources should be coming to our communities to help us do that. As many resources as went into our communities to try and dismantle and tear our communities apart, just as many resources should go back into helping our communities to be able to access healing in the ways that we see appropriate.
And I don't want to project, but it brings up anger for me hearing this and feeling. So I don't know, if it does for you, or if there's a way that you've worked with that anger to make it a creative force, a force of passion and of advocacy, because there's anger there, justifiably so.
Yeah, I think that's such a great. I love how you frame that, because initially there was I had a ton of anger around all of this, and what through the process and we're never done healing, right? But in the process of the healing work that I've been able to do, it has shifted to exactly that, from anger into passion, into a sense of like action and motivation to do something with it, which I think, speaks to, again, that piece around like, and this is something that I teach a lot about, is like emotions are not good or bad. They are teachers. They help inform us about something. Anger, there's there's anger that like, this is justifiable anger. It makes sense for us to feel angry about all of the horrible, horrendous things that happen to our families, to our communities. And if we stay in that like really hot anger of it, just like consumes us. And so what do we do instead to transform that energy of anger into something that we can utilize to be able to actually help make change? So yeah, I have a ton of passion around this, and what Brianna and I are really trying to do is figure out, like, we know we can't do this ourselves. So we're trying to figure out, like, who do we but who do we bring into the team when it comes to like within our Indigenous communities, within the research community, within just plant medicine, right? There's like lots of different allies and folks that are beginning to come forward, or people that we're thinking of even in our own communities. And we had several conversations with people in our communities, in our tribal communities, actually just on, what would it have been? Thursday, to talk about potentially, going through the MAPS training. Rick Doblin opened that up to Brianna and I and said like, hey, could you get like maybe a team of people from your community together to come get trained? And we were like, yeah. So we had some conversations. Wow. We have at least 2 additional folks from our community. One is, very connected to culture and spirituality. He runs ceremonies and things like that. Another one, she works with folks in the substance use, in the treatment area. So just trying to like pull together people from our own communities, but then feeling just super appreciative. So it was actually Dr. Joe Tefer that invited me to be on the panel for, one of the panels here at this conference, which then now has connected me to additional people who have come up and said like, how can I help? Or, let's stay connected. And so I think, we're definitely going to need a team of folks to move this work forward in our tribal communities. And I feel really excited, and I feel the energy building around it. I know it's going to happen, but I also know from hearing other people talk, like sometimes it takes it takes a while. You know, some people have been trying to, you know, work on this for decades to make some of these medicines accessible. And so we'll just have to stick with it.
And as much as your nation, your experience is unique, are there any consortiums that are starting to form around sovereignty and access and use of psychedelic medicines? It sounds like you're starting to talk about, are they forming? Does it exist yet?
If there is, I don't know about them. I think that's a great question. And I'm definitely going to research that, because I feel like if there isn't, I think there needs to be. Because again, it's like that, the more voices that are at the table, the more Indigenous people that are saying, like, pushing back and being like, no, we should, as sovereign nations, we should have access to this. And we want to determine how and where and when and all of these pieces. The more voices at the table, the better.
All right. So we're almost wrapping up.
Sure.
You have a podcast yourself. That's why you're so good at this. It's called Remembering Resilience.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So it started out of an idea from, the Tribal Neurosciences and Community Wisdom Project, which is a mouthful, was a project that I helped start after I got trained in adverse childhood experiences, or the ACE interface. And I got trained in it because when I learned about it, I knew about historical trauma. We were talking about historical trauma in our communities, but we didn't understand how it transmits through generations, through epigenetics and ACEs and all of these pieces. So I was one of the very first communities I had done a presentation in. There was a woman, her name is Maggie Rozo, and she runs the radio station, Niji Radio in White Earth. And so I had invited her to the presentation because I knew her. And afterwards, she's like, we got to get this on the radio. I was like, that's a great idea. She's like, we need to get this out to the community. Well, some things happened and we weren't able to do a radio show out of it initially. And so the idea of creating a podcast came about. And so the first, we've done only 2 seasons. We're hoping to start a 3rd season soon. But the first season really is just getting the information out there to our tribal communities, because it's amazing how many people in our communities don't even know or understand about historical trauma. So it's like, how do you even sort of begin to tie back some of the patterns and behaviors you're seeing if you don't even understand what happened to our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents? And so, you know, historical trauma, adverse childhood experiences, epigenetics, resilience. And then we interviewed 2 Native women elders who have been on their healing journey, working with our tribal communities on healing. So that's season 1, just sort of laying the foundation and helping people understand, you know, what these things are. And then in season 2, Brianna and I had a chance to interview Dr. Joe Tafur, and we talked about plant medicines, and Brianna and I both talked about our own, you know, healing and insights from the medicines. And then the last 3 episodes of season 2 are looking at sort of what the research says around, not what the research says around resilience, but the 3 core protective systems, the individual level, the relational level, and then the community, culture, and spirituality. So, you know, we did 1 on the individual capabilities, 1 on family and relationship attachment, and 1 on community, culture, and spirituality from an Indigenous perspective and from our own experiences as Indigenous women.
So Remembering Resilience is a podcast, but it really sounds like a manual and a process for educating on kind of on a mass level about this, kind of getting in touch with the stages of this journey. And I hope there's many seasons, because I hope that the evolution of what you're co-creating just continues to kind of amplify in the future. Wonderful work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you, Miigwech. I really, I'm hopeful, and I anticipate more seasons will come about, and we want to continue to bring more Indigenous voices into the process as well, into the podcast. But I guess I'd never thought about it being that sort of like that, but it actually has, when I think about my own journey and process, like the podcast itself is sort of unfolded in that same way. So yeah.
It's interesting how that happens.
Yeah.
And I can't let you leave, Susan, until you can explain to me, because I'm a bit thick. You have a doctorate from the University of Minnesota in philosophy and social administrative pharmacy.
No, so
No,
not philosophy. And I don't have my PhD. I don't have my PhD yet. Yeah, I'm a doctoral student. I am in the process of cutting back on work so that I can focus more on my dissertation. I mean, you know, like I said, I have like 3 young children at home. I have 4 children, and then working full time, and just like it's been hot. And then the pandemic, you know, like we did homeschooling for a year, which was crazy. But anyway, so just trying to like get back into it. And so I do not have my dissertation done. So I don't have my PhD yet.
So where are you now heading to with your thesis? What's the kind of title and focus?
So I don't have a title yet, and it's been interesting because this month has been incredibly busy for me. But like last week, Brianna and I were in Boston, and that's when we got a chance to talk with Rick and Michael and some of their team, and then being here. And so ideas are beginning to emerge. So initially, I was going to look at a qualitative study, just interviewing like 6 to 8 Indigenous people who have used psychedelics for healing. And now we actually might be doing a group study in tribal communities with psychedelic use. So it's hard to say, like, there's a lot of moving pieces right now. So we'll see. I have a meeting with Rick right after this. So hopefully we can get a few more things ironed out or sort of figure out like what might some of the next steps be. But yeah.
And Beauty, we were just talking about, the series of your podcast and, how the COVID pandemic has come in and kind of delayed you to some extent with your PhD, but also that maybe that delay's really helped to fertilize the genesis of these thoughts of what your community needs and what a solution potentially could creatively look like.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that because I feel like that's definitely been something that I have been learning on this process, this healing journey, is to trust the process. Even when I think about like when I got trained in mind-body medicine, when I came back, I was like, oh, I want to do this in tribal community. So I was literally asking everyone, like, I can run a group. And nobody took me up on it. And then when I started the work with Extension, the very first group I ran, I was like, oh, I would not have been ready to run a group 2 years ago or even a year ago. So it is that beginning to like trust when I'm ready, the things will come into place. And sometimes there's a delay or there's a stall and it might feel frustrating, but just trusting like there's something in the works, there's something that I don't see or understand yet. But if I can just, and this is again where that like tuning into the body, tuning into your spirit, like really trusting, like feeling energetically like, yep, this feels right. This is a direction that I'm supposed to be moving in. And so it is that journey of like beginning to trust myself again.
Thank you. And yeah, going to Boston, being here in Toronto, going home to Minnesota.
I can't wait to see my kids. It's been such a long month, but so wonderful. Yeah. Really, really appreciative.
Amazing. Yeah. And before we say toodaloo, anything else that you want to tell people about, if they want to find any of your information or kind of reach out to you on social media?
Yeah. People often ask that. They're like, where can we find you? And I'm like, I don't really do a lot of social media stuff. I mean, it takes time to sort of tend to that. And I unfortunately have not given much time to that yet, but they can find like the Remembering Resilience podcast on, like Spotify and I think Apple Music and things like that. If you go to and it's not a great website, but the University of Minnesota Extension, Family Development, Family Resiliency, my contact information is there. You can find me on Facebook. I'm not there. I'm not on there a whole lot. I know I have a Twitter account. I never use it. So if you check in there, I'm sorry. Don't check in there. I have a LinkedIn account. I don't I know what that's something that I would like to get better at, especially as I've been making these sort of like connections over the last year. I know I need to get better at that.
And it might be if there's a consortium building between nations, they can kind of share their strain there.
Yeah.
Okay. Susan Beaulieu, it's been an amazing pleasure talking with you and hearing about what you're doing. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real honor. Miigwech.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Miigwech. Thank you.
Okay, there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks a lot for listening. It's a special conversation with Susan. And looking back, we were talking about colonization, going back over centuries and generations. And the part of what she is doing is decolonization, kind of restoring, rejuvenating, regenerating her people and traditions. And it's awesome that plant medicine, psychedelics, a part of that process, and healing is really key to that. So thank you again, Susan, for being amazing in the work you're doing and for sitting with us at the conference to talk. Okay, everybody. So as usual, we'd love you to subscribe to our podcast if you haven't yet, and to like us on social media. We are everywhere. And our main website is called psychedelicstoday.com, where we have all of our blogs and podcasts and events to check out, and our trainings, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And if you would like to make a donation, you can go to patreon.com/psychedelics today. All right, everyone, wherever you are in the world, lots of love. God bless.